Hello and welcome to the 2025 MIFF Schools program. I'm Josh Nelson, and on behalf of all of the team at MIFF, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all live, learn and work, and to pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Here at MIFF, we continue to celebrate the history and contemporary creativity of the world's oldest living culture. As those of you familiar with the MIFF Schools programs from previous years will no doubt already be aware, these presentations have been created as an educational resource for teachers and students, providing an overview of each film text, suggesting strategies for analysis and topics for classroom discussion, and tying together aspects from the films to the various assessment criteria found within the language courses offered under VCAR, and also to subjects such as English and EAL, literature, media studies, and the film study course for the International Baccalaureate. In each of those curriculums, there's a real key focus on developing students' visual literacy skills and encouraging students to critically engage with media texts across a range of contexts and mediums. And this obviously becomes a really key component of assessment as students progress into their final years of the VCE. So for that reason, film analysis will be a key focus of these presentations, not as a replacement or as a substitute for the focus on language and cultural aspects, but rather as something that can sit side by side those key focus areas. While the MIFF Schools program is perhaps ideally suited to students within the French, Japanese, Mandarin, Italian, German and English language courses, the selected films in this year's program offer opportunities for study and classroom analysis across a really diverse range of subjects, abilities and age groups, preparing students, as I mentioned, for those text-based assessments and really developing those visual literacy skills. Now, I'm going to focus on the film techniques and terminologies that students would ideally have a familiarity with in just a moment. But before I do that, here a brief synopsis of the film might be useful. Now, I should mention, this will be a relatively spoiler-free presentation. I'm going to avoid, as much as possible, giving away any crucial plot details or revelations within the films themselves, while still providing you with an overview of the content of the film and suggesting some strategies and suggestions for analysis that should really help structure that post-screening and pre-screening classroom discussion and context. I Saw a King is an Italian language film set in 1936, following Benito Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, where fascist fervour has gripped Italy. For the young daydreamer Emilio, however, living in a small seaside town outside of Naples with his eccentric artist mother and domineering father, the town's mayor, politics couldn't be further from his mind. But when a deposed Ethiopian Ras named Abraham is suddenly imprisoned in the family's aviary at the bequest of Il Duce himself, the boy imagines that this prisoner of war is the fictional Italian pirate Sandokan, and the pair strike up an unlikely friendship, drawing them inexorably into the realities, horrors, and absurdity of the country's descent into fascism. I Saw a King is a colourful and at times very comic coming-of-age tale that carries certain stylistic echoes of Taika Waititi's Jojo Rabbit and Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth, anchored by its young protagonist's perspective and embellishing its stranger-than-fiction true story with outsized characters, a confusion of reality and fantasy, and socio-political farce. Award-winning director Giorgia Farina tells the story as a feel-good fable with a serious flip side, chronicling the loss of both national and childhood innocence alike. But before we look at this film in more detail, I do want to return to the terminology and techniques that I flagged at the beginning of the presentation, and that real core focus on developing students' visual literacy skills. And so I would actually recommend to teachers that prior to attending the screening, it might be really useful to either introduce depending on the age level of the students, or at least revise a selection of key film terminology and techniques that students should really be thinking about while they're watching the film. Because, and I realize I say this every year, it's crucially important to reinforce the need for students to actively engage with these films. Yes, they're entertaining. Yes, films are fun. But there also needs to be that expectation placed upon students that they'll be watching these films in order to analyze them. Whether that's as part of a non-English language course, or English, EAL, media, or a film studies unit. And on that, I would actually suggest that students take notes, or be encouraged to take notes during the screening. It's one way to ensure that they're going to be actively engaging with what they're seeing on screen. Now, I'll talk about some of these elements in relation to the specific film in more detail shortly, but just as a general overview of film techniques, something that might be beneficial prior to the screening, this might be a useful starting point. And look, there's no shortage of film resources online that can assist in that process, whether that's on YouTube or in, say, textbook form. I would also really emphasize from the outset that it's important that students can firstly identify the technique that's being used, that secondly, they can understand its general function in the context of film language and filmmaking, especially in terms of creating meaning within the film itself from a filmmaker's perspective. And then thirdly, that they can apply that knowledge to an analysis of the specific text in the context of the narrative, the characters, the themes and ideas that the film's exploring. And it's very difficult to achieve that final outcome unless those first two learning aims have been properly established and understood. And so with that in mind, some of the basic techniques that students should ideally be familiar with are things like cinematography, whether that's the close-up or a wide-angle shot or camera movement, the various components of mise-en-scène, which incorporates elements such as props, costumes, the use of lighting, the blocking of actors, the composition of the frame, where relevant, music and also lyrics, sound, dialogue, the use of voiceover, editing, narrative structure and story elements, and also visual motifs and symbolism. And so, as I mentioned, these are effectively the building blocks of filmmaking. So it's really essential, I think, that students have an awareness of these and come into the screenings with that awareness. Okay, so looking at the film a little more closely now. So some of the themes that are explored within I Saw a King are fascism, perhaps obviously, the theme of family, and again, I think the interesting aspect about the way this film approaches the theme of family is it works on both the kind of microcosm of Emilio's family, but also the notion of the fascist family, the family under Mussolini in Italy. You also have ideas and themes of friendship, of imagination, the interplay of fantasy and reality, of war and truth, of politics, sort of big bracket sense, racism and colonialism. You also have, as I mentioned, the loss of childhood innocence, also the loss of national innocence, and bracketing all of this, I guess, through the character of Emilio, is the notion of a coming of age. Now, when I approach a film text with a class, I often like to start from the big picture and then work my way into the focused filmic analysis. And there's a number of contexts that I think you could sort of fill in the gaps of students' knowledge in terms of Italy, Italian history, the history of fascism, the wars that are referred to throughout the film. So students, I think, would really benefit from having an awareness of the political, the historical, and the geographic contexts in which the film is set, as well as the contemporary relevance and resonances of the film beyond the specific historical and cultural setting of 1930s Italy. So the key figures here, I think, Benito Mussolini, absolutely. Students would definitely benefit from having an awareness of who he was, if they don't already, and what was going on in Italy in the 1930s and then through to World War II. So there's that historical political context of fascist Italy, which I think is important. The other element, sort of more specific within that the film deals with directly, is the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. And that's where, obviously, the character of Abraham becomes integral. For language groups, as well as non-Italian language groups, there are a number of other references that I think you could contextualize prior to the screening. A term we hear frequently is that of Balilla, which, from my loose understanding, refers to little boy, but also has these very specific connections to the fascist movement. And Balilla is a term that's used repeatedly within the film. So it might help if students have an awareness of that prior to the screening. But in terms of geography, the film is set in Roccasecca, so understanding where this film is taking place within Italy might be helpful. And at the end, and this is probably more applicable to slightly older students or students of a higher academic level, really having them understand that cinema isn't created in a vacuum, and that all films, whenever they're produced, can't help but respond to, whether consciously or inadvertently, their own historical moment. And if you've been paying attention to the news at all recently or over the last few years, you would have a sense of the kind of rise of neo-fascism across the globe. And I think this film is very much a timely reminder of what's going on in various places around the world. I don't think I need to name those countries. You might have your own perceptions of what is going on, but that Berkeley article that I've listed there, I think does a really good job of spelling out some contemporary parallels between the 1930s and the 1940s Europe and what's going on elsewhere around the globe now. Another context that I think is really useful in approaching film texts, especially for students who may not have a lot of experience with film analysis, and trying to give them a sense of the creative process and what goes through the mind of a director or various creative figures involved with a film, is to look at the production background through figures like the director. And here I've listed 2 interviews with the director of the film, Giorgia Farina, which I think would be useful as a resource. And I'll cite various quotes from both of those throughout this presentation. I've also listed some further references or resources there, which might help elaborate on some of the origins or inspirations for her making this film. As she says in that Movie Player interview, the film was born from a true story and from the morbidity of wandering around stalls of old books. I found a book by Nino Longobardi in which he told his story. He was the son of a podesta. A wonderful story, even if it almost seems like a folktale. So there's some key elements there, I think, that would be great as context or as a springboard for further analysis. But coming back to the point I raised at the beginning of the presentation and the importance of film terminology and students having an understanding of technique, being able to identify the technique, being able to elaborate on a technique's general function in the context of filmmaking, and then being able to apply those two to an analysis of the technique and the way it's being used in the specific context of the film, a specific scene, a shot, a sequence, whatever it might be. So students should consider how, for example, the film's cinematography, the types of shots, the use of angles, the use of different compositions or camera movement shapes our connection to the film and contributes to the film's exploration of various themes or characters. So, for example, a close-up shot like we have there of Abraham in the family's aviary. And again, students identifying the close-up, its general function, to create a kind of identification, an intimacy between the audience and the character on screen, an awareness and a connection of some kind, or to highlight specific details within the frame, whatever that may be. And students should be able to then apply that to this particular moment. This is a moment where Emilio is starting to form that bond with this character, because so much of the film is told from Emilio's perspective. It emphasizes that bond. The contrast then with a technique like the wide-angle shot, dramatizing in a way perhaps Abraham's isolation, his sense of imprisonment, his sense of being locked in while surrounded by the kind of natural beauty of the world around him. And again, his connection to nature is something the film explores throughout. So these kinds of shots aren't necessarily simplistic. Students might recognize the wide angle, might be able to tell you that it's being used in this context to dramatize setting or to draw our attention to setting, but it has these symbolic or subtextual elements as well. But again, it's that 1, 2, 3 step process. And here we have a shot of Emilio's dad in the low angle shot. That low angle shot shooting him from underneath, looking up, exaggerating his status, his sense of power. And it might be that the students think that the camera is reflecting how he sees himself, grandiose figure of the Podesta, or as a symbol of fascism, the key authoritative figurehead at this particular moment early on within the film. The high angle shot where the camera looks down on a character tends to do the opposite. It dramatizes that loss of power. And I think you could certainly interpret that in the context in which that high angle is being used. Looking down as an audience on top of Abraham. He's disempowered. He's imprisoned. He's caged. He's at the mercy of his captors at this point within the film. There are a number of other techniques that Farina uses throughout this film as well that I think are worth drawing attention to here. The cross dissolve, so an editing technique where one world sort of blurs with another as it transitions from one to the next. And in this case, we have a transition between the reality of Emilio's world and the kind of fantasy world, which we see him move in and out of at various points within the film. Much of this film is also shot at ground level. And this is something that I think you could draw students' attention to and have them consider why. Why is so much of this film shot at the kind of ground level? And I think there's an obvious answer perhaps for that, and that is it aligns us even further with Emilio's perspective. He's a child. By virtue of his stature in this world, he is closer to the ground. He also spends a lot of time sitting reading under trees or engaging with Abraham, which is what we see in that second image in the middle behind the bars. So again, not only does it situate us and the audience within Emilio's perspective of the world, it emphasizes a connection to Abraham as well. And here we have him sitting in his makeshift cell. Composition is also important, thinking about the use of geometric lines that we often get, certainly early on within the film. And that's emphasized by both the low angle shot of the Podesta and this shot, a reverse shot of the youth within the town lined up for the assembly. So here we have perhaps a visual representation of fascism. Everything in its place, in very neat lines, ordered, the absence of chaos. This is perhaps the fascist ideal being rendered in a graphic form at the assembly. And of course, that's contrasted throughout the film, and certainly through the character of Emilio, to the natural world, which doesn't follow those same kinds of rules. And the spaces that we see Emilio inhabit throughout the film, some of them like ruins and places that are decaying, are very different kinds of places. It suggests his out-of-placeness within the fascist system and his harmony with the natural world, which aligns him again with the character of Abraham. These are all things to consider when focusing in on the visual design of the film. The other element that I think is worth digging into here in that classroom discussion is the form and style of the film, and the way that Farina is very clearly riffing, as she mentioned in that earlier comment, on the folk tale and this stylistic approach of magic realism. So asking students to consider, why might the director have opted to adopt this particular approach in relation to the subject matter? What's the sort of relationship or conflict that's created within the film between, on the one hand, the kind of rigid doctrine of fascism and the kind of space of the magical realism, or the space of the folktale? Again, this is something that a number of directors have explored before, Guillermo del Toro with Pan's Labyrinth. So again, some resources that might be useful starting points in terms of familiarizing students with the characteristics of the folktale or folklore more broadly, and certainly with magic realism. But as Farina points out in that interview, for fantasy to work, you have to start from something authentic. If the basis is credible, the viewer is willing to follow you even when you take them elsewhere. Magical realism needs strong roots in reality to be able to fly. I think that is an ideal prompt for discussion in the classroom. Mise-en-scène is another key concept with film analysis, and it basically refers to everything within the frame working together to convey an impression of a theme, a character, an idea, whatever it might be. So it incorporates things like the setting, the lighting, the composition, the use of props, the blocking of actors within the frame, the use of costumes, etc., etc. All of those working together to convey aspects related to themes and character. So asking students to consider, what can we decipher about characters, their emotional state, the world that they inhabit, solely from the look of certain scenes or sequences? In the absence of dialogue, what is the visual design of the film telling the audience? What is it communicating? And here are a number of examples of contrasting mise-en-scène within the film. We have in the upper left, Emilio's parents. Think about the colour palette. Think about the design of the wallpaper. Think about the images in the frame. What is that telling us about their characters or about, indeed, their relationship? And think about how that contrasts to, say, other mise-en-scènes in different scenes. So the bottom right image, here we have Emilio dancing with his uncle, who's a far more sympathetic character than his parents in many ways. The background, the use of wallpaper, is a stark contrast. The greens, the vibrant greens of that wallpaper is a contrast to the one involving his parents. And of course, it's another way in which the mise-en-scène connects Emilio to the natural world and how he uses his imagination within the space of the natural world. Another good contrast, the image next to it on the left, the school setting, the sparse, sterile classroom setting with its pictures of the king and Mussolini and the crucifix just above them, and to either side of the frame, a map of the world and a globe of the world. Again, what are we to take away from the appearance of those props in the context of the classroom? How does it evoke the spectre of fascism and the ideals of fascism and global domination and so on and so on? Maybe the presence of religion in connection to fascism as well. So looking at some of the themes in a little more detail here. As I mentioned at the beginning, the theme of family is key here. Family is explored not just from Emilio's perspective, but across the wider cast of characters, on both the personal level, through the figure of Emilio and his immediate family, but also on this broader symbolic level, the nation family under Mussolini, under Il Duce. So how is the relationship between the various characters presented, and also in what ways are they all potentially trapped by their roles? The film is very quick to paint a fairly unsympathetic portrait of both of Emilio's parents, as we see here. What did I do to deserve an idiot son? And as his mother says, how many times have I told you not to interrupt me? By contrast, the uncle figure is presented far more sympathetically. And you'll notice the language that he's using in that upper right image to refer to his nephew, tiger cub. And of course, animals come into play as a key motif throughout this film as well. So how does the film develop this notion of family over the course of the narrative? And how does it broaden that focus beyond the family itself? And if you look at two of the images on the lower line, we have a question about women's roles, particularly within or under Mussolini's fascism, with one character remarking, "What does Il Duce know about washing diapers and colic?" And in another instance, we hear a character remark, "The Italian woman must be a wife and mother." So again, coming back to this idea of imprisonment and entrapment, not just in the literal sense for a figure like Abraham, but a number of the other characters within the film. So this is obviously a core theme in terms of the way it connects to a number of the other ideas that the film's exploring. As Farina elaborates, I wanted to tell a story through the eyes of a child. The film pushes you to think differently. It is a story of growth in the context of a decidedly dysfunctional family. I think of Eduardo Pesch, the actor who plays Emilio's father. A patriarchal, domineering father, sweetly mean, married to Sarah Sarajevo, an artist on the run. In a certain way, they live in a kind of cage. There you have it again. Perfect. So fascism serves as a fairly broad and all-encompassing focus within this film. So in addition to considering the various formal, such as magic realism, or tonal, such as the film's comic elements, strategies that are adopted by Farina throughout I Saw a King in relation to this theme of fascism. I think students should really reflect upon the significance of this particular historical moment in both its specific Italian context and, as I mentioned, the film's broader contemporary resonances. So you'll see throughout the film, again referring back to the kind of visual design, the almost omnipotent presence of Mussolini through Mussolini's head statues, which we see throughout the film, or the kind of fascist mantras, believe, obey, fight. But gradually we start to get counterpoints to that as well through the character of Abraham. Through the revelation, as he tells one character, your airplanes drop gas bombs on our villages. Or indeed, as Emilio's uncle remarks at one point, nobody cares about the truth here. Those two moments within the film, I think, create or provide fairly direct links to what is going on in the world today. I think this film is an ideal teaching text in that regard because of its immediate contemporary relevance and resonances. And those parallels are made quite directly in interviews with some of the cast members, including Eduardo. And I like that quote because it provides, again, further opportunities to broaden students' understanding of some of these cultural references, such as the Bocca di Rosa. And I've listed a link to the English translation of the lyrics there, and certainly the song's importance in a broader or wider Italian cultural context. And of course, a reference to Mario Monicelli there, the writer that Pesce has just referred to there, which may give students a deeper understanding of the specific approach to comedy that Farina has adopted throughout this film. The theme of fantasy is also a really key one within this film, and like films such as Life is Beautiful, the Roberto Benigni film, Pan's Labyrinth, as I mentioned before, and Taika Waititi's Jojo Rabbit, all of which explore the experience of children under a fascist regime. I Saw a King depicts or approaches Mussolini's fascism through the perspective of its child character in Emilio. So students could consider the reasons for this approach and the popularity of this approach more broadly. Is it because children see the world differently, for example? In what ways are fantasy and reality connected throughout the film, thematically or visually at various points? Is the world of imagination established in direct opposition to the sort of rigid dictates of fascism? And here we have some images of Emilio sort of play acting this sort of fantasy world that he's created at the beginning of the film, or later on, the way that fantasy world encroaches within the classroom context around the image of the king. And some subtle references that we get at other points, such as a conversation between two women characters where one of them remarks, "Do you remember playing war when we were little?" Again, a connecting kind of childhood fantasy to these more serious themes of war and fascism. The theme of colonialism and racism. So again, students could consider the ways in which this film explores themes of racism through a post-colonial lens, in which the bigoted views of the Podesta, Emilio's father, and fascist supporters are very much or very clearly situated in respect to ideas about colonial occupation and the plundering of resources, and also the very dehumanizing kinds of language that are used in respect to Abraham. And we have some examples of the kinds of references to the colonial incursion in the images I've selected there, and the kinds of language and the references to the colonial plundering. And again, as one of the characters remarks, the character of Signorina Gemma, as she explains to her class, Ethiopia includes Somalia and Eritrea. To the north it borders the Red Sea, to the south the ocean. It's full of great riches. There's cotton, coal, coffee, rubber, silver. Our valiant army conquered it with great sacrifice. I think dialogue like that really lays bare the kind of post-colonial awareness of what was going on at the time, and how the film reflects upon that, and how certain characters' views perhaps alter over the course of the narrative. One of the other key motifs within the film is that of art, and I think I Saw a King very much explores the power of art within a fascist regime. On the one hand, as a form of escape or as a form of resistance, but also, from the fascist perspective, as a means of propaganda. Students would perhaps benefit from understanding how art was used during Mussolini's reign. So in what ways does this film show art across those varying aspects? As a film about an historical fascist regime, in what ways is the film also about the importance of art, for example, cinema, in both representing the past and also providing a kind of vicarious way of exploring or coming to terms with those horrors of the past? And we do get a reference to a scene involving cinema. So yes, the film is sort of self-reflexive or self-aware in that regard to the power of art and moving pictures. So some of the other key visual motifs that students could focus on or analyse, certainly in that post-screening context, some of them I've touched on, such as cages and the sense of imprisonment or the theme of imprisonment. We have a peacock that we see at various points throughout the film. The peacock who was the former inhabitant of the aviary where Abraham is placed. And again, I think there's some interesting symbolism that's being played out through the level of the peacock in relation to fascism and some of the other characters. We also have a recurring theme of tigers, lions, cubs, like I mentioned earlier in relation to the uncle's comment towards Emilio, and to leopards. There's a brief shot of a photograph at one point involving an Italian fascist soldier who is standing above a leopard that he's presumably shot dead. And again, I think it's a very telling image in the context of the film's wider symbolism about animals, and perhaps provides some contemporary parallels to members of a certain political family that I don't think I need to name, who have appeared in similar photos in a more recent context. We also have, moving right along, references to food and the significance of food throughout the film, to hands or to physical contact and connection that's symbolized through the shaking of hands, references to fire, and also to mirrors. And I would encourage students to think about all of these sort of recurring visual motifs and their significance in the film's wider treatment of characters and themes. There are also, as I mentioned earlier, a number of cultural elements that could be used to follow up on that students may not have an awareness of, but certainly in the Italian context, I think are important. References to Il Duce, Balilla, Podesta, the fascist salute. We also have a reference through the uncle to divertissement, French term, but it certainly has an Italian comparison as well. As I mentioned, King Victor Emmanuel III, as he appears in the classroom setting. We also have other language elements which I think are important. Salam, as Abraham says, which means peace. And again, I think that Arabic is important, and students should understand the kind of connotations of the use of that term and its place within the relationship that develops between him and Emilio, and also the idea of the Ras, the Ethiopian Ras. As Emilio's father says, it's sort of a king, but again, students could delve a little deeper to gain a greater understanding of what that means. Without giving anything away about the end of this film, I think students should really think about what impression does Farina leave us with at the end of the film? What's the tone of the ending? Is there a sense of optimism and resolution? Or, given our historical knowledge about what would follow in Italy and Europe more broadly, are there doubts that are still cast over the future of certain characters? And here, again, I would encourage students to consider aspects of mise-en-scène, such as colour and costuming, setting and composition, and the kind of meanings embedded in symbolism like we see in Emilio's use of the spyglass. So a range of interpretations about the concluding stages of this film should very much be encouraged in the classroom. And so bringing things full circle in terms of putting into practice students' familiarity with things like terminology and techniques, their approaches or strategies of critical analysis, their ability to apply that to a given text. The assessment task of a review, I think, is a really useful one. So students could be tasked with reading and critically engaging with other published reviews of the film, and then respond by writing their own. In an Italian language course, they could be writing that in Italian. But importantly, drawing on their close analysis of the film and utilising the terminology that I've referred to throughout this presentation. So just as an example, I've listed a link to a review on the movieplayer.it website from Elisabetta Bartuca, who writes, "A story of discovery of the other and of oneself, where the power of imagination becomes an instrument of liberation and resistance, and the innocence of a child the only weapon against xenophobia and fascist ideology. I Saw a King is this and much more. It's a folk tale, a fable, a comedy, but above all, it is a deeply political cinema, capable of reclaiming fragments of humanity and civil responsibility that modern times seem to have lost. Using devices dear to her, such as animated incursions to represent the imaginary world of the little protagonist, the grotesque tone of comedy and the dreamy tone of the fable, Giorgia Farina creates a small masterpiece with I Saw a King. Through a coming-of-age story, she reflects on the value of freedom and the power of imagination as a subversive act. The unfiltered gaze of a child becomes a weapon of rebellion and anti-fascist resistance." It's an excellent and very relevant and timely quote. And with that, we have reached the end of the presentation. For information regarding bookings, age suitability, or additional details for all of the films in this year's MIFF Schools program, head on over to miff.com.au/schools, where you will find all the information and resources, as well as links to the rest of this year's festival program and screenings. And so, on behalf of myself, Josh Nelson, and MIFF Schools programmer Kate Fitzpatrick, we'd like to thank you for watching this presentation and to wish you a very enjoyable and, more importantly, educationally rewarding experience at this year's film festival. Thanks so much.